Hello. So today, this is Mr. Fredericks. Today we are going to do a screencast on the beginning of the Cold War, the early conflicts. We all know about the Cold War a little bit, but where did we run into some problems immediately? That's what we're going to try to figure out. So what caused the Cold War? We can't really talk about the Cold War without knowing what caused the Cold War, right? And that was lots of things. Fear of nuclear war with one another, fear of a communist revolution taking over, fear of how big the Soviet Union was, efforts to stop the Russia from getting bigger, and the U.S. felt it had to be them. Eastern Europe was taken by Russia, the Soviet Union after the war. The Iron Curtain speech, basically Winston Churchill said that the Soviet Union was evil and trying to take over everything. That fired everybody up. The World War II lesson of no appeasement. Basically, they're acting bad. We can't just let it happen. We have to go get them. The Russian Revolution, originally the Allies and the U.S. sent troops to put it down, and that pissed off Russia and the Soviet Union, and it showed them that we were the enemy. There was yellow journalism. Basically, newspapers make money off of getting everybody fired up about an enemy, so they exaggerated how bad the Soviet Union was. Demagoguery. People get elected into office by exaggerating how bad everybody is, and so all of our politicians were talking about how evil the Soviet Union was. The way to get elected into office is by accusing your enemy of being soft on communism, and that meant everybody who won had to go after communism to get elected. And then, of course, something called confirmation bias. Now, that's a lot of reasons why we hated the Soviet Union and they hated us. But the end result of all that was a massive amount of fear and anger that we felt towards them and they felt towards us. So how did this fear and anger impact world relations? Well, let's go back to the beginning of the Cold War. In 1946, the world was seemingly going to hell, and the Cold War was just getting fired up. Communism seemed to be growing. In 1946, the Soviet Union would start something that they probably couldn't finish. So during World War II, there was a country called Iran, and basically at that point, the Soviet Union went into Iran and basically to protect it from Germany taking it over, because the Soviet Union was like, we can't let Germany get the oil in Iran. So the war ends, and of course the Soviet Union is supposed to leave, but they don't leave. They say, I'm not leaving. I really want to stay in Iran. It looks nice here. But really the thing about it was the Soviet Union has no access to water. And we know that by water, I mean ice-free ports. All of their ports seem to be way up in the north, where there's icebergs, and so ships can't trade with the Soviet Union. So what they want to do is they want to conquer to the south so they can have ice-free ports and then trade with the rest of the world, and trade leads to commerce and wealth. So that's a problem. So, but anyway, what do? Now that they're in Iran, they know that they are so very close to having access to an ice-free warm port called the Persian Gulf. If they can just hold on to Iran, then they can start trading that way. So what do? They kind of take over Iran and they set up a puppet government that they can control that invites them to come in. And what should the U.S. do now that the Soviet Union is taking over Iran, just like they took over Eastern Europe? Well, Harry Truman says, no way am I letting this happen. So he orders them to leave, and when they don't, says, hey, I'm the only country with a nuclear weapon. You better leave or else. We start moving the USS Missouri into the Eastern Mediterranean. That's basically a show of force. The Soviet Union's like, all right, I can't mess with the US now. They have the nuke. Someday they would have the nuke. And they take their troops and they move out of Iran, and Iran then becomes somewhat free. And that was a victory. It's a pretty good example of how, nobody wants to stand up to anybody else. Everybody wants peace and to be friendly. But yeah, but Truman standing up to the Soviet Union resulted in them giving the freedom to the people of Iran, and that's a pretty good lesson. So 1946, we then have a second Cold War conflict, and the Soviet Union, again trying to get ice-free ports, is going to basically try to get out to the Mediterranean Sea through the Black Sea and so on. So if you look here of how that works, the Soviet Union had access to the Black Sea, but they couldn't actually get all the way through the Sea of Marmara and the Dardanelles. And that is mostly a problem because there are two countries that own those things and aren't letting the Soviet Union get through them. And that would be Greece and Turkey. So Greece and Turkey control those waterways, and they're in the way of the Soviet Union getting the Mediterranean as an ice-free port. So the Soviet Union says, all right, we just need to take over Greece and Turkey post-World War II. So they start funding and giving weapons to communist groups in Turkey and Greece and telling them to fight to take over those governments, because if the communists take over those two countries, then they'll allow the Soviet Union to go through them. And that is going to lead to massive revolutions of communists trying to take over those countries. And the communists actually appear to be winning. They're going to win Greece and Turkey, and this will change everything. So what should the US do? Well, Harry Truman gives a very famous speech called the Truman Doctrine. to Congress and says that the Soviet Union is trying to take over the world, one country at a time, Greece and Turkey right now. And there's nobody left to help. The US is the only one who can do it. So for the next 20 years, the United States, the last 20 years, the United States has embraced isolationism and minding our own business and just letting the world exist. But no, that's not good enough anymore. We have to stop the Soviet Union from taking over the world. We're the only ones who can do it. So Congress, give us $400 million to give to Greece and Turkey so those governments can buy weapons to kill the communists to prevent those revolutions from being successful. And yes, and that's what we do. We give money and weapons to those groups, and what happens? The communists get crushed in Greece and Turkey. Greece and Turkey remain our friend, and the Soviet Union does not have access to the Mediterranean and those ice-free ports. We win, and Greece and Turkey remain our allies. But also, the Truman Doctrine definitely changed U.S. foreign policy. It said from now on, no more isolationism. We have to contain the Soviet Union, or it will grow and take over the world. We don't have to go to war with them. We just have to stop them from growing, and that is going to be a compromise. Now, in our country, the United States, there are hawks and doves were against war, and hawks were like, we need to use war to get what we want. Hawks very much were against containment. They basically said, you know what, that's too weak of a policy. We have to go after the Soviet Union. We have to crush them. We have to free all the places they've already conquered. And of course, the doves were like, are you kidding me? That's going to lead to World War III. We don't want to invade Eastern Europe and take that land back. It's not worth it. We just fought World War II. So I don't know. Containment was a little bit of a compromise between the doves and the hawks because the doves wanted peace and the hawks wanted war, and this will allow us to prevent war from happening with a little bit of aggression by stopping the growth of communism. So that would be the policy of containment. It would stop the growth and a little bit of money and weapons and so on. So hopefully we can avoid World War III by containing communism and without attacking it, though. So in summary, the Truman Doctrine was a good policy. It did not free Eastern Europe. Hawks were upset, and it did not free the communists who had taken over China. And that did make us look a little weak. But in the same way, we did avoid World War III, and we didn't die. So the Soviet Union tried to take over Iran. We stopped them. They tried to take over Greece and Turkey. We stopped them with the Truman Doctrine. The third test of the Cold War would be not Iran or Greece or Turkey, but the Marshall Plan. In 1947, Europe, after World War II, was completely destroyed, mostly by us, right? And when we took the land back from Hitler. And they had no money, and that made them unhappy. They didn't have enough food or heat or shelter. Europe's poverty and suffering was a problem because when people are poor, they tend to love communism more than capitalism because under communism, the government supports you and protects you. So as Europe is slowly in their destruction turning to poverty and to communism, in 1947, we realized we can't lose Europe to the enemy. So we say, all right, you know what? What we're going to do is we're going to do the Marshall Plan, named after George Marshall, who came up with the original idea. We're going to take money from the American people because we were the richest country in the world, and we're going to give it in the form of billions of dollars to all of Europe so that they can actually feed themselves. So they're not miserable and they don't turn towards communism and they remain our allies militarily so. So that's what we did. We gave them billions of dollars of food and we rebuilt their homes. We gave them shoes, blankets, roads, food, firewood, clothing, everything they could possibly need. And yes, absolutely, we turned them from angry into happy. And as they climb themselves out, metaphorically speaking, using the Marshall Plan away from Kremlin and communism, most of Europe stays on our side, particularly Western and Central. Now, there was one restriction. We said, all right, we'll give you the money, but all of your purchases have to be from American companies. So not only are we doing the nice thing and preventing you and supporting you and helping you and preventing you from turning to communism, we're also stimulating American businesses. Yes, the U.S. government goes into debt, but American businesses will be doing good. So what ends up happening? Boom, we help Europe get back on their feet. We win. They don't turn to communism. So we stopped communism in Iran and Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan saved Western and Central Europe. And then the next Cold War conflict was the Berlin blockade. In 1948, one country we weren't sure if we should help with the Marshall Plan was Germany. If we rebuild Germany, won't they become evil and all-powerful like they did in World War I and World War II? The Soviet Union wanted Germany completely stripped of all factories, so they had to be farmers and weak. The Soviet Union wanted them to be weak, and we understood why. The U.S. even wanted the same thing for a time, but to prevent another war. But now we realize the greater threat was the Soviet Union, not Germany. And we didn't want the Soviet Union to be able to invade Western Europe the way they invaded Eastern Europe. And we needed Germany to be able to stand up to them. So what we decided was that Germany would be put back together and given Marshall Plan money, and we were going to rebuild them up. And this pissed off Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. He's like, oh my God, this is not okay. How are you rebuilding this country that just killed so many of us? So, I mean, again, so let's go back in time a little bit to understand what's going to happen in the situation. 1945, Germany was cut into pieces right after World War II. We cut them into 4 pieces, we occupied. And ultimately, Britain, the Soviet Union, France, and the United States took over those 4 pieces. Berlin, which is in the middle of the Soviet part of, like each Germany got cut into 4 parts. Berlin was the capital and the most wealthy part of Germany, and that was all the way in the middle of the Soviet Union's part. So we're going to cut that in 4 spaces too. Now, the reason why that's awkward when Berlin got cut into 4 spots is because if Berlin was that circle in the middle, that made sense. We could divide it into 4 spots, but the circle in the middle was actually in the middle of the Soviet Union. So it was completely surrounded by the East German Soviet controlled area. That's awkward because now we have troops and people completely surrounded by the enemy during the Cold War. But one good thing about this is they were nice enough to give us a road from our part of Berlin all the way to our part of West Germany. But in 1948, there was a problem. The US was worried that the Soviet Union was going to eventually attack Western Europe. So we said we need to build Germany back up and give them money and support so that they can stand up to the Soviet Union if they ever invade. So we combined our sections together financially and eventually militarily and made West Germany. And that made Stalin angry. We just made a part of Germany really powerful again. So he pouts and says, all right, you can have your West Germany, but you can't have my part, Berlin, which is in my section. I want you out. But the problem is that the US under treaty had the right to Western Berlin, which was in the Soviet section. So we say no, and Stalin knows he can't do anything about it because we had the right to be there. So anyway, Stalin says, all right, you know what? I'm not going to attack. That will be World War III. My other option is just to make the western part of Berlin, which is in the eastern part of Germany, so unhappy that they just leave and the US takes everybody out. And that's going to be called the Berlin blockade. So let me explain. So that road that the Soviet Union generously gave us to get from West Germany all the way into West Berlin, which was surrounded by his land, the Berlin blockade is going to come when they stop letting us use that road. So the roads get blocked, the railroads get blocked, the canal gets blocked, the water pipes get cut off, the electricity gets cut off, the heating oil can't make it to West Berlin, consumer goods can't make it, people can't get food to eat. Now, that means the West Berlin people, for only a short period of time, can survive there because winter's coming. And they're just going to have to voluntarily leave, and that will give West Berlin to the Soviet Union. They'll get what they want without firing a single bullet. Should we fight? No, we can't fight because in West Berlin, we are completely surrounded by the Soviet Union, outnumbered 62-1. So the choices here are, number one, we could just abandon West Germany. Like, is World War III really worth it? Number two, we could give West Berlin to the Soviet Union as a gift, but that would be appeasement. Somebody acts like a jerk and then we give them what they want. They'll just teach them to keep acting like a jerk. So no, we could just break through the blockade and get to West Berlin, but that would lead to World War III. And that's not, and do we really want another war? World War II just ended. And that could lead to nuclear war. The Soviet Union's about to get the nuclear weapon, and they do in 1949. So what does Truman decide to do? Does he decide just to give in and give up West Berlin and those people? And ultimately, he decides a fourth option, the Berlin airlift. We're not going to break through. That would cause World War III. Instead, we'll fly over it and hope that they don't shoot us down because they don't want to start World War III. And we'll bring the supplies that are needed to West Berlin. It's a pretty radical idea. It required trillions of dollars, 200,000 flights. It got to the point where one of our flights landed every 45 seconds. 1.5 million tons of supplies were flown in there. We used to bring bombs over in planes. Now we're bringing milk. U.S. bombers, was keeping those people alive. The West Berliners loved us. We gave them everything they needed. We gave them oil, supplies. Stalin didn't shoot the planes down. Why? Because that would have started World War III, and he would have looked like the bad guy. He did some passive-aggressive moves during the Berlin blockade and airlift. He jammed our radio signals at a time when planes couldn't communicate. They'd crash into each other. He took searchlights and basically aimed them at the eyes of our pilots. You can see an image of that right there. He buzzed our planes. Soviet planes came within feet of our planes without hitting them, trying to get us scared into crash. And that often would be what would happen, right? He put up these huge balloons so our planes couldn't land easily in West Berlin. So we'd have to go around them, and that led to crashes. That was not a good thing. Even with all of these efforts, the United States still successfully kept the West Berliners alive with all the food and supplies. Now, there was one famous story of Gale Halvorsen. He was known as the chocolate bomber. One day he's flying supplies to West Berlin. He notices a kid, and he drops with a little parachute, a little handkerchief down, a chocolate bar. Next day, he's got lots of them that he drops down because he notices tons of kids are there. and 250,000 boxes of chocolate he eventually drops. Now, the Soviet Union is trying to starve these people, and we're dropping candy to their kids. Stalin looked terrible. We looked amazing, like we were the heroes. What does Stalin do after about 10 months? 11 months, excuse me. He calls off the Berlin blockade. He gives us back our road so we don't have to fly over it anymore. The Berlin airlift was victorious. The blockade failed. And that would be Cold War victory number 4. But the US at this point is so super nervous. We're like, oh my God, if another conflict breaks out, the Soviet Union has so many more troops in Europe than we do. We can't possibly win. The Berlin blockade showed how weak we were. So we're completely surrounded in West Berlin. Stalin can conquer that area whenever he wants. So that said, what does the United States do? And as a response to the Berlin blockade, we decide to unite for strength. We form a military organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We're basically the United States and Canada combined with Western Europe, specifically West Germany. And basically we say that if the Soviet Union attacks any one of us, it's an attack on all. An attack on one is an attack on all. The idea is they can attack West Berlin because they know they can take it out. But we're telling them an attack on West Berlin is now an attack on the US, and we will nuke you. So you better not do it. And that was the purpose. So the historical lesson is you got to be aggressive to keep people under control. Now, the Soviet response to us forming a little alliance of Western Europe and us is they're going to form their own alliance called the Warsaw Pact. And that's going to be Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. An attack on one is an attack on all. We're now two big gangs, right? So 1950, this is just the beginning of the Cold War. It's going to go on another 30 or 40 years. It's going to be crazy. Cold War is ongoingly and sad. But the objective of this presentation was for you to understand how it started and the major events to begin with. Thank you so much for listening.